Faith Crowley, patriotism editor of Reading Digest.
Oh, I love your magazine. My favorite section is how to increase your word power. That thing is really, really, really good.
Well, good. These are special VIP badges. They'll get you into places other tourists never see.
Miss, what does the I stand for?
Important.
Ooh, how about the V?
Very.
Oh, and miss, just one more question.
Person.
Ah.
Hello, and welcome to the Simpsons Countdown, the podcast in which we go back to the beginning and watch all of The Simpsons to trace the creative evolution of the series and count down, finding the exact moment in which it began its downhill journey into irrelevance. I'm Erix Antoine, and this week I'm joined by my good friend Joshua Fine. We'll be discussing Mr. Lisa Goes to Washington, which originally aired on September 26, 1991. It was written by George Meyer and directed by Wes Archer. In this episode, Lisa wins a patriotic essay contest about the United States. She and her family attend the finals in Washington, D.C., where she is shocked to discover corruption when she witnesses her state's congressman accept a bribe. She goes on to lose the contest by writing a new, more scathing essay condemning the government. But the corrupt congressman is jailed and removed from office, which restores her faith in the system. It's The Simpsons, operating in the firm ground of political satire, albeit more earnestly than they more famously did later. And if nothing else, it gave Josh and I a chance to have a cool discussion about the nature of political commentary, the importance of getting involved in political action, and how our views are always going to be skewed by our own personal experience. And some of us will apply that skewed perspective to foreign scenarios, where it is maybe not relevant. Despite how heavy that may sound, I promise it's a laid-back, agreeable talk. So without further ado, here we go.
So burn the flag if you must. But before you do, you better burn a few other things. You better burn your shirt and your pants. Be sure to burn your TV and car. Oh yes, and don't forget to burn your house, because none of those things could exist without 6 white stripes, 7 red stripes, and a hell of a lot of stars. Thank you very much.
Yeah, damn right!
I'm just going to go right into it. This is a political episode of The Simpsons. But before we get to that, what I will say, because it had been a while since I'd watched it, and it's kind of weird how the first act deals in Homer's obsession with Reader's Digest.
Oh yeah, it kicks the whole thing off. Reader's Digest. If you grew up in the 80s and 90s and you visited an elderly relative, they would have Reader's Digest probably on the in the living room. That and TV Guide always would be paired with that. And I was listening to the commentary of this episode, and they were talking about, it was George Meyer who wrote this episode, talking about the banality and blandness of the magazine, so much to the point that he actually wrote a parody of that magazine in college, which is something I know that the Harvard Lampoon and National Lampoon used to do quite a bit. And I used to read Reader's Digest. I remember this in 9th grade English, because the teacher I had was a shambling burnout. So we didn't do very much, and there were a stack of Reader's Digests in the class. So I remember reading quite a few of those.
I think that this must be, it certainly was the case for me. I don't know if it's the case for you, but like I never read Reader's Digest. Like never.
Never.
You pointed it out, like they use it in schools. Mm-hmm. But I'm pretty sure that you have the same experience or something similar to this, where you go to grandma's house and you go into their den or whatever, and there's going to be the shelf that'll have, when I went to visit like my stepmom's family in Framingham, Massachusetts, they had this shelf that was, one shelf was like floor to ceiling of National Geographic, mm-hmm. and then the other shelf was floor to ceiling Reader's Digest. And not only that, but like Reader's Digest's condensed books, which is, now that's something that I was very familiar with, because there were like entire collections of this. And then one thing that it wasn't something I was aware of as a child, but then when I came to live here in Bolivia, already like officially, not just on vacation, but when I came to live here in the early 90s and went to my grandmother's house, Reader's Digest was also available in Spanish. Okay, that it's an internationally famous magazine, and sure enough, you've got a shelf, and the shelf is still there. It's still there. If I take you to my to my grandmother's house and you walk to the front hallway, there's that shelf at the front hallway. It's a long hallway, and on the wall there is a ton of Reader's Digest magazines stuck in a shelf there. And I'm just like, wow. So people, I mean, this was a thing. People were really into this. So it's just funny that Homer, of all people, is just so obsessed with Reader's Digest.
Well, it's one of those magazines or those periodicals that just are designed for, like, you want to say the common man. It's like that, USA Today. But you always see Reader's Digest at the grocery store checkout. I remember that. I would flip through them. It was just one of those banal magazines that you'd get for general news and information. I mean, that was more so then than now, because obviously most of that's gone to websites. But I'll mention this about National Geographic because I had a similar experience like that in school libraries and in people's houses. And when you go through those very old National Geographics, I always like going through them for the ads, just see what ads looked like back then. And also the way the printing process was back then. There was always this particular odor from the ink coming off that magazine. Not like I was getting a buzz off of it, but it had a very distinct musty odor. I had a similar experience with that with comics when I started buying comics when I was like 15, and that had a lot of heavy dark black inks. And there's a graphic novel I read called Black Hole. I think it was done by Charles Burns. And
yes, it's great.
It's excellent comic. I don't know how at one point it was supposed to be adapted. I don't know how that would have been possible, but it has such heavy inks you could, get a just the odor could knock you out. But yeah, you just going back to Reader's Digest again. It's just one of those general news magazines that you would see, and it was pretty much the most inoffensive thing you can get. National Geographic, you could, possibly because they would have nudity, as the old cliche would go.
Yes.
Desperate for pornography, couldn't find anything else. But Reader's Digest, it's just the most non-confrontational, general knowledge for men and women. Anyone could pick it up, from 9 to 90 could read it, and it was always there, and it's still around. But yeah,
that was my question. I was wondering if it was still around. Like, is it actually still around? Like, you can still find physical copies of Reader's Digest?
Because I don't know how it is in Bolivia, and I haven't traveled much overseas, but I see this magazine just sitting there in the checkout aisle, like where the tabloids would be, and those magazines still exist. But yeah, you see it right there, and it's still kind of in that old pocket-sized shape, if I remember correctly. Because TV Guide went to magazine size. It's no longer the little squat book that you hold in your hand.
Oh,
End
that
of an era,
sucks.
I know. I've never, unlike Homer, I've never tried to jam a magazine in my shirt pocket. But yeah, he enjoys this magazine a lot. Yet he's remarkably dumber, seems to be, in this episode than we've seen in previous seasons, as we see with the VIP scene. And when the judges at the Veterans of Popular Wars try to interview him, thinking that, this essay is so good that clearly this had some parental involvement. And then when they talk to Homer, it's like, we're going to give you 5 extra points.
That is a good point. That although he gets obsessed with the idea of reading, and you have a very rare moment in which Homer decries the idea of, Bart and Lisa sitting in front of the quote unquote the idiot box, right? When they could be exposed to such a rich, cornucopia of knowledge, or whatever he says, and you go like that, but that's out of character, and it sort of goes against the fact that he's still portrayed as a dum-dum, even though, well, I mean, he hasn't he been reading a whole lot more and kind of opening his mind. And the thing about it, because this is true, like what he says, it's not just one magazine. They take hundreds of magazines and squeeze them in, because that's what it is, right? It's essentially a selection of articles because it's monthly, I believe. And yes. So it takes a bunch of articles from a bunch of magazines. And they tend to be like general interest articles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The only other things I remember with Reader's Digest is they would have this like section called Humor in Uniform. So you can possibly get a sensible chuckle out of what's being described. But basically, like that little cartoon he sees with the
Mhm.
woman who can't drive, you would see stuff like that. That's exactly what it is. It would compile other stories. I think it would even say like this story was in this article, was from this magazine, and it would just compile all this stuff, and it would just be, as you said, general interest, ranging from a bunch of different topics. There was a magazine like that for kids. It was called Boys Life, and it was for the Cub Scouts, and it had similar things. It had tales of adventure. I remember every Boys Life had a comic that was about some true tale of heroism from the Cub Scouts. And I was never in the Scouts, but you would get this in the school library. And again, it would just be something that no one could get mad at this type of thing. And yeah, every Reader's Digest, I think, even would have maybe even have contests, and that's what leads to Lisa joining this contest. I'll mention one other thing about Homer reading. The man even quotes Tolstoy.
Yes, but he goes like, as Tolstoy said in quotable notables. But I think there was something similar to what you're describing. I don't remember like Boys Life specifically, but I do know that when I was in elementary school, and this might have even gone on to like the first couple of years of middle school, there was something like that that would come out every month, and they would pass it out, like hand it out in class. And I don't remember what it was called. It was the something reader.
Oh, the
You
Weekly
know,
Reader.
yes, there you go, the
It was
weekly
like
reader.
this newsprint type child's newsletter. And and then when I was in fifth grade, I remember we had like a more sophisticated Scholastic magazine. And I remember
Yes.
this was 1994. I remember looking at it, and it had like the world leaders of the time. And here's Bill Clinton, and here's John Major, and here's some other people in other countries. And I remember that vividly. Yeah, but the Weekly Reader, that was something that we would read. And then if you want to talk about niche magazines for children, I actually was subscribed to this. It was, you've heard of Consumer Reports magazine, right?
Of course
Yeah.
I have. Yes.
So Consumer Reports had a magazine for children. It was called Zillions, and it was like a personal finance magazine for children. Obviously, this didn't last very long.
How
But
to manage your allowance. Well,
but yeah, I was a subscriber to that, and I think that lasted all of like maybe 1 year in 1995. This is a real thing. I advise all listeners to look it up and see exactly what I'm talking about. It wasn't exactly bad advice, but it was such a strange thing that it's like there's no way that this is sustainable.
I was reading the Zillions, and it's because you got to understand, I'm making $20 a week, so like we gotta, it's like I mow the lawn or I wash the dishes or whatever it is. I work hard for my $20 a week.
What investment vehicle could I put in for $80 a month? I don't know. What kind of bonds can I get? But yeah, such a thing did exist, and it's just again one of the, like, much like Consumer Reports, you could have it, and it would be it's like the perfect type of reading material you'd have at any doctor's or dentist's office. You know what Time used to be. Newsweek doesn't really exist anymore, and any type of other general news, magazine. Reader's Digest wasn't quite that. Here's the other thing. What I would say Reader's Digest is like, it's basically like women. There would be these women's magazines like Red Book and Ladies Home Journal, and if you want something general, something for men, it wasn't Sports Illustrated, you could go with Reader's Digest. That's the way I would see it.
Right. Yeah, something like that. And then of course you have the condensed books, which were bestsellers. They were bestsellers, but usually those condensed books had like 4 novels in them. So that they'd taken like some book, like they'd taken, I don't know, James Clavell's Shogun, and like shrunk it down to about 100 pages. And I go, how does this work? This isn't even Cliff's Notes. Like, like what? How does this even? How do you get anything? It's basically like somebody. I don't even like. I never actually bothered reading them. I would flip through them because they usually had illustrations and stuff like that. Like, so they were like cool to look at. But I never actually read the whole thing because even back then I was a bit of a purist, and I was like, if I'm going to read a novel, I'd like to read the whole thing, because this is going to be what? This is just going to tell me a short version of the story. it was always just kind of interesting to me that
This may
this was
be a little
popular.
bit before my time because I don't remember those. I mean,
Okay,
obviously I'm aware of illustrated comics, I'm aware of Cliff Notes, I'm aware of abridged audiobooks, but I don't remember the condensed novel. And you'd feel like that'd be even something that people would make fun of even at the time. But anytime someone would make fun of like, oh, I got a paper I got to do and I don't want to read this 400-page book, they either would say, well, go watch the movie or read
right.
Cliff Notes. I never heard of these condensed novels at all because it seems like if you're going to do that, you're just going to go get Cliff Notes anyway. I guess if you don't want to cheapen yourself to that level, you'll go, I'll go to the condensed novel, and somehow that'll help. Even though the concept of that seems ridiculous because it's not the author making the choices of what to cut. Cliff
Right,
Notes
exactly.
is the summary, and that's
Yeah.
clearly what it is. But a condensed novel, boy, that just sounds strange to me.
I imagine they must, if the magazine still exists, I imagine these things must still exist. I mean, they weren't, as far as I know, I don't think they were like sold in stores. I think these were things that, I mean, let's say you were a subscriber to Reader's Digest, and I would imagine that it was similar to like Columbia House or some kind of a book club kind of thing, where every month you'd get an offer on, a condensed book thing. Because, like I said, it would have 3 or 4 novels in one, right, in one book, and it was a hardcover book, and they tended to look nice. They had like nice artwork, and they picked out whatever the seasonal bestsellers were. And so, like, I guess if you're someone who would love to read all these things but don't think you have the time, but you just want to get a sense of what the books are like, go right ahead. I mean, you're not going to really get, like you said, I don't know who was in charge of taking the novel and like taking James Clavell's Shogun and condensing it to about 100, 150 pages, so it could be one of 3 or 4 novels in a bigger book. So it's just funny to me. Like I always found that really amusing and wondered if that was still around.
Yeah,
But yeah, we're not here to talk about Reader's Digest. We're here to
yeah,
talk about Mr. Lisa Goes to Washington, which I think it's a good episode. Okay, it's a good episode. Has some issues which we can get into, but it's generally good. It was interesting to watch so many years later. Okay, and just kind of get a sense of a different time. That is when this episode was made. I think that not to say that the things that it observes are no longer true. They absolutely are. But I'm saying that the way that it chooses to observe it, I think, is very truthful to the time. Because one thing, there are parts that are a little bit cringy, you know,
I
because
agree. You're talking about the scene with the gay male flight attendant, or
well, like that, I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. I mean, that's just a throwaway joke.
yeah,
But I meant, like, okay, like for instance, you have the montage of kids reading their essays, which is
right.
it's very cute, but it's very kind of earnest, and it's a little bit cringy,
Yeah, I agree with you on that, but you want to keep this in mind that and they say that in the episode that this is an essay contest for kids 12 and under. So you're
Yes,
not
yes.
exactly going to get sophisticated commentary on the American electorate here.
Oh,
Although
absolutely.
I appreciate this line from the kid from Alabama, where basically saying that his back was spineless, his belly was yellow, and that he was the American non-voter. And I actually got a laugh from me on that. But yeah, it's these types of contests, you know what you're going to get. So I actually kind of wonder, what exactly kind of commentary you're going to get out of a children's essay contest, especially when it's such a you know corny topic, if you want to put it for lack of better word for it.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like, I don't think like that's not really it's what you expect it to be, but there's something about the way that that's put together. I mean, I got a laugh out of it too because I still remember, and that's something that stayed with me even from when I first watched this. Because I watched this when it aired, and I watched this at the time I was in New York, and so I'm sitting there, I'm a native New Yorker watching it, and ding, dong, the sound of the Liberty Bell, and that stayed with me. That is something that I even up till today I tend to sometimes just quote it randomly, like when I'm just making a joke, or when I'm like singing to myself as I'm washing dishes, and I'll just be going like ding, dong, the sound of the Liberty Bell. It's just something about that like, but that's not so bad. I think like that's fine. It's like, as I say, it represents the fact that these are 12-year-old kids or under, right? And they are supposed to be very patriotic essays. And I do like that Nelson essentially is well, he's a Tea Party kid, isn't he? I mean,
Well,
it was
he's
like
definitely quite the Tea Party MAGA type, if you want to slap that label. I'm not a big fan of necessarily trying to analyze fictional characters and their real life voting patterns, which was a
yes,
thing throughout these past couple of years. Thankfully, relief has been achieved, and I don't expect that case anymore. But talking about flag burning, which was a real hot topic at the time, because at that point in I think it was '89, Supreme Court said it was free speech to burn the flag. So a lot
right,
of people got really upset by that,
yeah,
and the attitude of like, oh yeah, you could burn the flag, you better burn everything else on top of it. It goes into that classic America love it or leave it attitude. I happened to
yeah,
be reading a book on the it was an event in 1970 called the Hard Hat Riot, where a bunch of blue collar iron workers went and took it to a bunch of hippies when they were protesting in New York City. So I just happen to be clued in on that. And there is definitely that devoted America does what it does. It's the unquestioning patriotism and loyalty. Unfortunately, that gets corrupted, and that's certainly another discussion. But yeah, Nelson's speech definitely plays even this day. Certainly would probably get him at least one segment on Fox.
yes. Well, no, but the thing about it is that here this is going to like where I'm going with this because again, this is 1991, different time, and so what Nelson is portraying, I think there's truth to this. I mean, there is a truthfulness to what is being illustrated here, and Springfield, even though the state is never named, we can assume it is probably a Midwestern state. It is probably a Midwestern town. It just seems to be that that's what that is. And so it makes sense that it's probably a red state also. And what's interesting about that is that, Nelson says what he says and he gets cheered for it and he gets applause for people who like agree with that attitude. And Homer is one of those people, you know? And so it implies that Homer is he's at the very least a moderate conservative.
I would say this. I think he's a low information voter because you see that when the woman asks him like, are you interested in politics at all? He's like, I don't know, and
Right.
it's I wouldn't even say it is conservatism. I think it's just that it's apolitical and he's easily swayed.
Yes.
So
Okay. That's
that
better.
that I think, yeah, the politics of this show has always been kind of odd because and we're going to see more strains of that come through the '90s. That there is a bit of an apolitical streak, is I think in the early part of the show, but at the same time they will make fun of Republicans. I think it's generally sarcastic. What I appreciated with this episode, I thought there was an excellent line at the end. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance, which is true. And
Yes.
a democracy can't survive without constant participation and maintenance. But I don't think necessarily again that Homer's a conservative. Ultimately, he's a blue collar guy. I think he's a cipher. You could take it any number of ways, and there have been tons of think pieces and books like that. Again, it's trying to analyze the voting pattern of a fictional character, which I always thought was kind of ridiculous. You're not in that person's head. So it's, again, you can go down the rabbit hole on this quite easily. And it's certainly about the nature of politics, I think, that especially after everything that has happened, that you can easily get wrapped up in this. And I know I did. But, I live here in Los Angeles, an extreme blue state. And what ends up happening, and also because of the media, is that it ends up being almost like sports. I don't know who said it. It was like politics is like Hollywood for ugly people. So we end up being that, and this is why I'm curious about how it is in treated in Bolivia. And I think that over here there's a lot of, especially on the more liberal side of things. And again, you can label it however, liberal, progressive, whatever. Is that it ends up being like this ridiculous spectator sport for the overly well informed. And the thing is that they're not doing anything. They're watching, they're commenting, they make suggestions, but they don't get involved. So what is the point? It ends up being like looking at like it's sports, and it's a real waste of time.
I mean, I could talk for hours about this, and I won't. But do you have a specific question, or do you just want me to sort of give you a general overview?
I would say give a general overview, but maybe like perhaps how the media portrays politics in Bolivia. Is it a similar vibe to what I'm describing? Because I know elections are run differently. So I guess how people view politics as well.
I think we can talk about it. I kind of want to talk about it because of bunch of things that have been going on, and I figure it's kind of relevant. I mean, this particular episode of The Simpsons doesn't really have to do with elections and doesn't have to do with that aspect, but it does touch on corruption in Washington, and it does touch on like corruption in the government as a theme. And I think that corruption in the government is a universal theme because this is something that happens in every government all over the world, in on different levels and in different ways, but ultimately it boils down to the same thing. Ultimately, it still boils down to people who are in power, people who are certain authorities who have the power to pass laws and make certain decisions that that they have been elected to make those decisions, and these people in many cases will still be just looking out for their own interests or for corporate interests or whatever else. And so that's something that is true, I think, all over the world.
Oh, not only that,
No.
it's always been that way. That's why I always, when I see some ridiculous, obviously I think for her it was quite shocking. You don't have a scene of someone talking about, this has always been the case. That's why it kind of amazes me when we go to the end of the episode and Lisa delivers her cesspool in the Potomac speech. Everyone's all shocked and horrified. These are all a bunch of Washington gadflies who know damn well what this system is like.
Yes.
I think it reminded me of when they had this ridiculous thing, the White House Correspondents' Dinner, and they had Michelle Wolf, who can be hard to listen to at times, and she's very adamant about that. But she was right about what she said, and the Washington media went absolutely apeshit over how dare she make these claims. And it's like, well, no, she's absolutely right. And it's like, well, who's working for whom here? And yeah, Washington, at least in the way I'm describing it, for that type of media and for those people, makes, again, this goes back to what I'm saying about sports. They make it seem like a game. Then what is the point of me trying to watch any of this? We have Sunday political news shows every week. Does anyone actually care about stuff being discussed on this? Absolutely not. Nobody does. Or trying to make things that seem like they matter, they don't. And again, nobody cares. It's like that with the guy working at the piano. Like,
You're talking about the ragtime dude, the whole
ragtime,
the trading gap, the budget, was it the trading gap shuffle, the trading gap shuffle?
You already talked about this. That was the budget gap. This is the trading gap. No one cares. Even though these are, admittedly they are important, but if you're someone out there trying to, pay your rent every day, you're not exactly going to give a damn about what the trading deficit is. So,
yeah.
It's trying to make things that seem important that are not, making it more than what it is, I guess. That's what this is something I had to think about a lot, because I used to think about politics the same way a lot of other people did. But let me let you continue about what you were trying to say.
Yeah, well, where I was going with this was just that, I mean, that stuff is the same in general terms all over the world, right? But where things differ is in the specific socio-political environment of a given nation. And that is going to be different because, no two countries are exactly the same, or at least no two regions certainly are, right? And so there are a lot of little nuances that go on in Bolivian politics, but also in Latin American politics, that I think there is this tendency for, let's say, people in North America, people in Europe, that will view Latin American, quote unquote, banana republic politics. They're going to view it with a very sort of like a narrow lens. And so they're going to assume that because they're aware of certain political realities, let's say in Argentina or in Chile in the 70s, because they're very well informed about that means they know all about what happens in Bolivia in 2019, which, no, I'm sorry, dude, you don't know what you're talking about.
And that seems like a real condescending attitude. I mean, it reminds me of like any time when there's a Democrat running for office and say, well, the Democrats are going to screw this up again. How? Or, that make them look like a feckless party. And it's like, how?
Right.
Where do you get this? I mean, we're talking about tropes that are now 30, 40 years old by this point. And some people still traffic in them. It's the most lazy type of stuff out there, propagated by people that definitely know better. They're certainly educated enough to know better. And
Sure.
I find it aggravating because these are people that may have even been in the Ivy League, and they've certainly gotten education that's worth hundreds of thousands, if not possibly millions of dollars, and they're trafficking in the laziest, tired tropes out there. And I imagine for you, it's in what you see about depicted in Latin American politics, it's again, it's condescending and it's infantilizing.
Yes, it can be condescending, and it can also be. I mean, there is this paternalism.
Hmm.
Okay, it stems from a paternalism because these are people who, by and large, I understand that a lot of the people who want to comment on Latin American politics, their hearts are in the right place. Okay, they're coming from a righteous place. They're coming from a place where they think they know what they're talking about, and they think they know the path to this or that, and so they want to contribute an opinion of value. But the opinion is misinformed. Now, you asked me a direct question about to address your specific question about how politics are here. And what I can tell you in terms of how the media portrays them or how that's basically the same like as it is in the States, in the sense that you're going to have different media outlets and you will have media outlets with certain biases, and that's going to be the same. And obviously, even within the society, you'll have people who are going to have certain views that are in opposition to other views. Just like anywhere, you've got a right wing, you've got a left wing, you've got moderates, you've got centrists, you've got a far right, you've got a far left. I mean, you have all of that. It goes on, and it's pretty much the same. As I said, that in general terms is exactly the same. But where it differs is in the specifics. And I think that for me, at least, for me personally, why I end up clashing with so many of I'm going to call them my quote unquote progressive friends, okay? Why I end up clashing with them sometimes, it's not because I disagree with them
Hmm.
on the general issues. It's not because I disagree with them that, of course, single payer healthcare and like all these issues that are very important for U.S. politics, and on some level world politics as well, and even in Latin America, things like this, all the issues, we are going to see eye to eye on the issues,
Hmm.
but then they get mired up in things that they start to look at it in generalities, and I think it's very hard for them to understand how it's possible that I can be like, when it comes to the U.S., when it comes to U.S. politics, I would consider myself, I don't want to say far left, but I have progressive values. I mean, here's the thing, I have progressive values. So, in this last election, full disclosure, I voted for Biden. I voted Democrat. And that's because that was the right thing to do and the only thing to do as far as I was concerned. And I can understand that maybe some of my listeners will disagree with me. And so that's why I'm not going to get bogged down in that. But I'm just trying to explain that's where I'm coming from. Now, I have progressive values, but I've always considered myself, when it comes to U.S. politics, to be slightly bipartisan, because I do believe that there can be, I mean, not lately, but in a general sense, I think that there can be a possibility for both sides to have valid points in an argument, in a political argument. So you should try to look at what both people are saying. Not, like I said, again, I want to make this very clear, not lately,
Not
but
lately, no.
but historically.
Yes, there was an interest in trying to actually govern the country and solve the
Yes.
problems that were happening. We don't have, and politically, I think you and I could pretty much agree with. I'm not going to get bogged down necessarily on the label thing because that's a nebulous term. And then usually the conservative talking points, if there are any, are usually handled in such bad faith they're not genuine, and it's impossible to see that they're actually being serious about what it is they're talking about. And usually the answers seem to be either tax cuts or judges, and that's all they have. They don't
Yeah.
have, there's nothing beyond that. And I'm sure someone, and it's true, there is a conservative political sphere that actually tries to analyze these problems, but it's being drowned out. And I grew
Right.
up in a more conservative family, although admittedly, my dad, who was much more conservative, kind of did it as a retaliation against his parents, who were classic New York liberals. If I want to get really down to it, I think my dad, if I wanted to slap a label on, was probably more of a libertarian. If we want to get bogged down in that type of thing, but
To your point, we're saying about labels. That's exactly where I'm going with this. See, I've always been very careful about that because I do think that now it's become this thing, like you said, it's like sports, where it's like you're either on this team or on this team. And there's this, that's why people want to look at it on such narrow terms. And so to sort of bring it, to sort of give you a general overview of what my problem is and why I'm so frustrated, is that last year, okay, in 2019, a very bad thing happened here, where like a corrupt government attempted to commit electoral fraud, and in a bid to hold on to power that at that point would have been unconstitutional. The administration of that moment tried to do this and failed, and there was a public outcry, and ultimately the president was, he fled the country, and it was a huge mess, right? And a year ago, I got into fights with progressive people online, progressive Americans and Europeans who, all thought that a great injustice had been committed against this wonderful hero, this wonderful indigenous socialist hero. And why was this? Because in the progressive movement there is this very, and it's an understandable, let's call it a pattern of thought, that because they want the same things. And so obviously they will cheer on socialism because they will see that as, well, this is really the way, and et cetera. But what they're failing to see is that may be true on your terms. That may be true when Bernie Sanders is talking about it in relation to how things, in relation to American politics and in relation to like the American structure of things. And that may be true, but it's not true when you apply it to Bolivia, because first of all, Bolivia is not a socialist country, and it was not. It, like, for the 14 years that the quote unquote socialist president was in power, it was not a socialist country. This was not a socialist country. I'm sorry, it just isn't. It doesn't function that way. And I live here, and I know. And people say, oh well, because you have, but you have free health. No, you don't. We don't. It goes like, oh, it's health insurance. Okay, it's like, yeah, you get, it's the same as it is in the States. Okay, it's basically, this is how it works. And I'm going to lay it out to you right now. Yes, there is healthcare, but it's tied to your labor, to whatever your labor sector is. So like, if you happen to work as a teacher, you are going, and it depends on what level you are, but you are going to have access to this particular health insurance. That's for people who work in the academic sector. If you work in banks, in like a bank, you are going to have access to this particular healthcare that is for the banking sector, and so on and so forth. And if you work for a private company, the company might provide a private insurance firm to cover for healthcare. So that's exactly the way it is in the States. And then you go like, and there's free education. There's public education and there's private education, just as it is in the States. Difference is that the state-run education is actually terrible. Okay, at least as far as the schools are concerned. University, the public university is it's a good university. They have good teachers. There are bureaucratic problems with it, but it does work. And so, but my point is, it's the same as anywhere else. It's when it comes to like a state-run university or a private university, it's the same as the difference between like a city college. It's the same thing, is my point. And
I think it's because they saw that guy, they saw that he attached himself to the socialist label.
Yes.
And then so they just assumed, they just didn't go any further beyond that. That's all. It was a surface level analysis, without bothering to do anything beyond that, and they just took it, lock, stock, and barrel.
And so, and it doesn't help when like the heroes of the progressive movement, the political heroes, such as Bernie Sanders or AOC, go on Twitter and like defend him. And so like that stuff, I think, delegitimizes the cause, because they don't consider that by doing that, they're actually praising, an autocratic despot. Okay, just because the party or there was some rhetoric that seemed to align with their beliefs, but did you actually analyze the reality of what happened over the past 14 years and what happened over the elections and what happened here and what happened there? And so like I got into fights with people. I was called a fascist. I was called bourgeois.
And again, these are people probably commenting from Canada and across nowhere you actually live there. That's the thing that I find.
Right.
Because these are the same people that if you try to make a statement about what's going on in some other country, they say, well, you don't live there. How could you even say that? What gives you the right to make a comment on that? You're actually living there. You're witnessing this.
Right.
And they're saying that you're misunderstood and you're living in the middle of it. How ridiculous is that? It must have been infuriating.
It was extremely frustrating, and it made me angry, And then eventually I kind of got over it. Whatever, I kind of figured, because again, I understand that a lot of these people, most of these people, their heart is in the right place. They are just misinformed. I get it. Okay. And the only thing that it happened to me, like I ended up having a change where I said, okay, well, you know what? Now that I've been through this, I think that's the last time that I start to comment on like the politics of a nation that I have no familiarity with, like that I know nothing about. So like, if I hear that something's going on in some country in Africa or whatever, if someone tells me of an injustice, I will obviously say, oh, that's terrible. But I'm not going to have any strong opinion until I know, because what do I know?
Yeah, you're not going to be able to do anything. You
Right.
You didn't spend time doing deep background here. What are you going to say?
Right.
I know when like I'd comment on like stuff going on in the UK, I'd make the most surface level comment because I know I don't know anything. Because I think it's just funny, to me anyway. But it's what I would expect in the States, and to anyone who lives outside. And I see it all the time with Kamala Harris being the next vice president of the United States, thankfully. There's going to be discussion about who's going to replace her Senate seat, and so you look at comments from people that don't live in California that pick the most obvious person that they're aware of and not aware of anything of the dynamic of what goes on here and what the expectations are of who's going to replace her in the Senate. So and again, it goes back to what I said earlier about being a parlor game. I used to participate in this stuff, and unless I'm actually involved in a campaign or actually doing something, there's no reason to get emotional about it. If I'm not doing anything, what's the point? I canvassed for Elizabeth Warren. I gave quite a bit of money to a bunch of candidates that didn't win. And that's the name of the game. But at least I did my part. I just don't understand how you could be that well informed but not be able to apply yourself in any fashion. And there's just no room for cheap cynicism. That's the one thing. Again, what I appreciated in this episode is that the system did work when it wants to. Interestingly enough, I mean, it wouldn't take place in a day. Usually that these public officials get nailed for corruption, and it's happened on both parties since the founding of the country. Usually they'll get pressure to resign, they'll leave, then they'll get indicted, then, maybe they'll get as I said in the episode, goes to jail, becomes a born-again Christian, possibly tries to reform, maybe gets sent on some sort of right-wing grift if that happens. But I appreciate this episode because it was not, because there have been more, cynical attempts by this show in regards to politics. They did that with, that Halloween episode with Clinton and Dell. Although that was the '96 election, I can kind of give you, understandably, that was such a low stakes election. You were right to think that maybe I should vote for Kodos, but that attitude generally doesn't fly, and I can't imagine that kind of lackadaisical attitude. I imagine that goes on, where you are, but I think there must be different stakes, and you don't have that kind of, I guess again that kind of privileged attitude to just say, well, they're all corrupt, doesn't matter. What am I, it doesn't mean anything to me, and the hell with everyone else. I mean, I know that goes on, but
Sure,
I'm curious to see if it has a different dynamic where you're at, or if it exists as much.
It's tricky because like the way things worked here for 14 years, there was this sense that it doesn't matter who we vote for because Mas is still going to win. Because I mean, they control everything. Yeah, there are 10 parties participating, but there's only one that's actually going to win anyway, no matter what we do, because that's they control the courts. They the public, they control the public sector completely. Okay, the government has so much power that ultimately people will vote for them just to keep their jobs. That's why they'll do it. Or you have a situation where there are opposing parties, but you're going to have them, huge parades in support of the current party, because these people who work in the public sector have been told it's participation is voluntary. But if you don't go, we will be taking attendance. If you don't go, don't come to work on Monday. You know what I mean? So ultimately, and I know I have friends who work in the public sector. I know that this is how it was. So obviously, when you have that level of control, nothing matters. And so eventually people got tired of it, and that's why there was the public outcry. But here's the irony. Here, okay, so we booted the guy out, but then over the next year, the transitional government fucked things up, let's be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they finally called to elections, by that point, they had given Mas enough time to mount a good enough campaign that they were able to go to elections and be elected again, but obviously not the same people.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different president, different vice president, but still it was the same party. And what that told me was, okay, so in the end, the party still has a lot of power. The party still has a lot of support. It was just that they were tired of that guy. They were tired of the people who were running it before. But they were perfectly okay with voting for the party again if it meant they could keep their jobs, as long as it wasn't that same fucking guy whose face you're tired of seeing after 14 years. But, you'll vote for some other guy. You'll vote for another face because whatever. So that's kind of the problem here specifically, where the reason that here people might have the attitude of it doesn't matter is because, yeah, it kind of feels like it doesn't matter. It kind of feels like the party in power just has too much control over everything, over every aspect of everything you're doing, so that, your vote doesn't feel like it matters, even though it does. But people have the feeling that it doesn't. And so, like, that's where it gets kind of tricky. Now, like going to this episode and what you were saying a minute ago, where the system works. And I kind of want to talk about that because, yes, in this episode, basically what it is that Lisa, she wins the essay competition. She's written this very patriotic essay. And so when she arrives in Washington, she witnesses something that shakes her to the core and like destroys her faith in America and in democracy and in all those things. So that's fine. But when I was talking about the cringiness, I do think that, and that's why I wanted to see your take on this. I do think that it got a little bit, it went to a really earnest place at the end. And and you brought up like future episodes that handled this a lot more cynically. And so I was a little surprised because not only future but past episodes, because if you look at like the one where Burns runs for governor, or like there's a certain element of cynicism there. But when you watch this episode, it really brings home that the 90s were a much more naive time. Because you get political commentary that's like this, that's very, it's very critical of Washington. It's very critical of Washington, but it basically exonerates the president, okay, in favor of sort of tarring and feathering this fictional congressman. And, that to me seems like they would have been a little bit less, let's say, nice about that at a different time for the show. Like I just felt, that whole thing where, my bosses, all, how many, what does he say?
250 million of them.
All 250 million of them, right? Yeah, so like that to me came off as, and ironically enough, a couple of months after this episode aired, that's when Bush, in fact, when he was on the campaign trail, actually did that whole speech where it was like, we're going to make this country, the people more like the Waltons and less like the Simpsons.
Like the Simpsons, yeah.
Yeah. So ironically enough, even though, this particular episode had treated him, I think, very kindly.
You say a naive time. This is coming off of, 15 years after Watergate. And then, a couple of years prior, you had Iran-Contra. And I think it's an episode, it's more about the system than any one person. Is it an earnest opinion? Yes. I think it's the fact that the system can work, again, when it wants to. And I think it's an attitude that, to me, there's no other outlet. You either have to believe it can work if the right people are there. or you you don't. Then what do you do with your life? So I think you just have no choice. I know it was interesting when they kind of Lisa looks at Washington and it becomes like a Thomas Nast cartoon, which is intentional because they
Yeah,
decided
yeah, yeah.
Thomas Nast, and you see like it's like the most typical lazy political cartoon you could find of here's Uncle Sam and he's doling out money and look at this, the politicians are pigs, they're eating at the trough.
And wiping their mouth with the American
The
flag.
American flag. Those are the same symbols that you see now in political cartoons, and it couldn't be any lazier. I think
Yeah.
in political cartoons these days got replaced by memes, where it's an actual image, and then you just write in captions for what that represents. To me, it's just like, what else can you say? It's also, this is a little girl who had, she's not. What else is she gonna do? I mean, she can now be jaded about the nature of politics. I mean, what? How's that gonna work? And this is an 8-year-old girl. So
Yeah.
I think it's I think the other thing I noticed when I was watching the episode, they said, we have 2 female senators, and now we're up to 26. And the thing is that it's just for the way Washington works in national politics, it takes a long time. Sometimes it doesn't. What you think takes a long time suddenly takes no time at all. At the end of the day, and this is not something that this episode really portrays, and I actually kind of appreciate, is that it's not making a statement that it's basically saying that yes, this system can get run roughshod, it can be corrupted, and then there are people it can't correct itself. I think that what people need to keep in mind, certainly this is my experience, is that it's a long process, but if you want it to change, you got to get involved. And I don't mean saying volunteering for a campaign. I mean, voting is pretty much the least that you could do. It's not a
Yeah, I agree.
it's not a difficult act. And you fill in a bubble on a piece of paper, you mail it in, you go to a polling station. That's all you have to do. I don't know how it is for you. Did you ever get involved in any political campaigns or like that?
No, not really. No, I've never been, never really had the opportunity because, I mean, I have been living here for a very, very long time, and I've never really, like, whenever I've gone back to the U.S. in the time that I've been living here, it's always been for short bursts of time.
Right.
So I've never been in a situation where I had the opportunity to get involved in the US. And here, as I just explained, at least for the past 14 years, why would I even bother getting it? It's like it just wasn't something. I'm grateful that I've never depended on the public sector for employment. But I feel bad for people who, because I understand. I mean, you gotta earn a living, you gotta feed your family, you gotta live. Friends of mine who work in the public sector, I feel for them because I know that for them it's been tricky. But although I will say I did get involved, quote unquote, last year. I participated in the protests. I got involved. That's how I got involved. But I was just one of the man. I was one of many. I was one of
I mean, you were
millions.
doing your part. I mean,
Yeah.
what are you, I mean, there's only so much you can do, and you were doing something. That's the important thing. And I especially imagine if you live in a national capital, whether it's La Paz or DC, completely different dynamic. It's just something that we're not accustomed to. I'll say this about DC, because I know you went there. I appreciate all the locations being shown in this episode.
Oh yeah, that was great.
That
That
was
like
great.
that's I wanted to comment about on that.
Let's
I
talk.
think, yeah, they went into great uh, pains to like try to make it really because this was the first episode. At least, yeah, I'm pretty sure that it was the first episode where they were going to a real place.
Yes, they talked about that in the commentary. They said that Bart had been to France in an earlier episode, but this was
Okay,
the
yeah,
first
right.
the family
That's
went on vacation
yeah,
to an actual place.
right. And even like Bart goes to France, but most of that episode, first of all, it takes place both in Springfield and in France, but also, you know, Bart's in that villa the whole time, and
In the
like,
countryside somewhere.
right. So it didn't really even matter. It's not like they had to like recreate Paris. But in the case of this, there's like, okay, they're in Washington, so let's have some fun. Let's actually like, depict the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Memorial and a fictional memorial to Winifred Beecher Stowe, who what was it whose image was on the 75-cent coin that was short-lived. And that's kind of funny because it's a funny gag, but I thought to myself while watching it, I was like, why didn't they just reference Susan B. Anthony, which is clearly what they're going for?
Probably because there's no Susan B. Anthony monument, so they just wanted to create a fake monument, I guess, to have that scene where she witnesses the congressman taking the
Right.
bride, because it's a monument that no one went to. I'll say this, and I know you've been to DC. You go to that Lincoln Memorial, and it's an imposing statue.
It
It's
is.
huge, and
Yeah.
you go up those steps, and you see him sitting there. Jefferson Memorial just as well. It was interesting when I went there a couple years ago. Of course, no one was there. It was being restored. It's a nice memorial. Now,
I
it's
love
not.
it. I love it. I actually prefer it to the Lincoln Memorial.
Oh,
There's
it's
something understated about it. I like the way it's housed. It's like
mhm,
it's more understated, and you walk in there, it's like he's surrounded by quotes,
yes.
and he's like, and in the center has a rather, it's an impressive looking statue. There's something peaceful about that monument. That's what I felt like when I walked in there. Not just because there were not that many people there, but just that there was a feeling of,
It's
there was
serene.
something sobering. Yeah, exactly. There was something sobering about it.
It was
You know?
like that when I saw the because I walked around the National Mall and I went to the MLK Memorial and you see the giant statue of MLK carved into the rock. And you're looking at him and you can see right into his eyes and yeah, it's a serene image and again from a place where I don't you don't really have statues. You don't have a lot of monuments. You have a lot of murals, but you don't have a lot of monuments. It really puts you in a different place.
Ding, dong, the sounds of the Liberty Bell. Ding, freedom. Dong, opportunity. Ding, excellent schools. Dong, quality hospitals.
And I appreciated the artist renderings of both the old growth and then when the forest was clear cut. Like the old growth
Yes.
forest, you see there's like a fallen tree and it's crushing a deer, and there's some
Yeah, yeah.
vultures looking at it. And then the clear cut forest is like they're all happy and smiling.
So, yeah, using stumps as tables for like their afternoon tea. No, as you said, it has a lot of funny gags, visual gags, a lot of witticisms. It's not like I didn't find it to be like a gut busting episode.
Mhm.
And ultimately, I think because it's trying to make some serious points. Like it's an episode that it's asking you to take it seriously. So I think that's why they don't get high on the wackiness quite yet. Plus, again, I think the show is still in a transitional period. It's still it's still trying to sort of straddle the line between being, a grounded, realistic sitcom and a slightly hyper real, kind of wacky,
Yeah, it's more surreal.
satirical show.
But
So this straddles that line, but it's still kind of, it wants you to take its points seriously.
I think so. I think it's like a sarcastic earnestness. I don't know how to describe, put that. I know it seems like a contradiction in terms, it probably is, but when it's going to make its jokes where it does while still being about the topics it's handling is still going to be earnest and sincere. But yeah, we're definitely starting to see more of what we recognize The Simpsons as in this episode, as you said, of jumping the gorge. I think this episode in particular has some, again, we're seeing the show come into its own and what we know it as.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree there. And I did speak up a little bit about some of the corny earnestness of it, like I work for Uncle Sam and whatever. But I do think that the point of the episode, the thrust of it is still sound. It's still effective because when you look at it as a story about Lisa coming to realize the truth about corruption in the government, right? And her eyes opening up to reality. So there's like that coming of age element and that aspect of her realizing the truth. But, you know, yeah, it has to have a slightly happy ending in the sense that her faith does have to be restored.
Mr. Jefferson, my name is Lisa Simpson, and I have a problem.
I know your problem. The Lincoln Memorial was too crowded.
Sorry, sir, it's just...
No one ever comes to see me. I don't blame them. I never did anything important. Just the Declaration of Independence, the Louisiana Purchase, the dumbwaiter.
Maybe I should be going. I caught you at a bad time.
Wait! Please don't go. I get so lonely.
So that's it for this week's installment of the Simpsons Countdown. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this, consider showing your support. It's really very simple. Give us a like or a favorable rating. This podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, Anchor FM, and other podcasting platforms. So adding a brief review, if possible, might actually help boost the podcast's profile. And if it isn't too much trouble, please do share this with all your friends on social media. Speaking of social media, you can follow the Erix Antoine Network on Facebook or subscribe to it on YouTube. You can also follow me on Twitter at ErixAntoineNet, and feel free to find me and follow me on Letterboxd, where I frequently post film reviews you may agree or disagree with. I'm Erix Antoine, and I'll be back next week when Troy Anderson and I will be discussing When Flanders Failed, in which Homer wishes misfortune on his good-natured neighbor, only to watch the wish come true and feel bad about himself for being such an asshole. It's a fun episode, and I hope you'll join us. In the meantime, stay safe out there. See you next week.
This ancient art has become a little too popular with today's kids. How do you stop them from getting tattoos? The answer is in Reader's Digest. No magazine gives you so much up to...
Shh.